Once again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
The Kingdom of Verlan had weathered wars, famines, and the slow erosion of old traditions, but nothing in its 500-year history had prepared its people for the announcement that would come from the Alabaster Palace on a gray Tuesday morning. Inside the palace walls, a decision had already been made, one that would end a marriage's public standing while leaving its private bond intact, and one that would force a king to choose, in the coldest terms imaginable, between the woman he loved and the crown he had sworn before his ancestors to protect. King Aldric had known for weeks that this moment was approaching. He had delayed it, negotiated around it, and hoped, foolishly he now believed, that some quieter solution might present itself. None had. With his eldest son, Crown Prince Fenwick, seated beside him, and his sister, the Duchess Yulara, standing near the window with her arms folded, the king read the final draft of the royal proclamation one last time. It stripped Queen Isabeau of her title, her constitutional authority, and every ceremonial duty she had carried for 11 years. It did not end the marriage. It ended the reign she had shared with him. The proclamation had not come from cruelty. It had come from necessity, or so the king told himself as he lifted his pen. Isabeau was not in the room. She was 2 floors below, in her private study, unaware that the paper being signed above her would rewrite the rest of her life within the hour. The trouble had not begun with scandal or infidelity, as the palace gossip would later insist. It began, as these things often do, with a slow accumulation of small defiances that no one had been willing to name until it was too late to undo them quietly. Isabeau had married Aldric during the difficult years of his father's decline, when the monarchy itself seemed uncertain of its own survival. She had helped him steady it. She had absorbed public hostility that might otherwise have fallen on him, defended unpopular decisions in interviews she never enjoyed giving, and stood beside him through 2 decades of a reign that had, by most measures, succeeded. She believed, reasonably, she thought, that this history had earned her a permanent place at the center of Verlan's monarchy. But permanence is a fragile thing in royal households, and Isabeau had begun to feel her influence eroding months before the final crisis. Prince Fenwick, now 34 and increasingly visible in state functions, was being consulted on decisions that once would have passed through the Queen's office first. His wife, Princess Odile, had taken on ceremonial duties with a composure that impressed palace staff and unsettled Isabeau in equal measure. The Queen watched the shift happen in small increments, a briefing she wasn't invited to, a foreign delegation greeted first by the prince, a household decision made without her signature. She did not see this as generational transition. She saw it as erasure. The breaking point arrived after the Continental Summit, a diplomatic gathering of neighboring monarchies held at the Alabaster Palace itself. Isabeau had expected to lead the ceremonial hosting duties, as she had for the previous 3 summits. Instead, palace protocol officers directed foreign dignitaries toward Fenwick and Odile for introductions, treating the Queen's role as largely symbolic. She endured the day with visible composure and private fury. That evening, in a family meeting meant to review the summit's logistics, Isabeau demanded final approval over all future diplomatic hosting arrangements, a request that would have placed her above the crown prince in a matter of state protocol. King Aldric refused. He explained, as gently as the moment allowed, that Fenwick needed to begin assuming greater responsibility ahead of the eventual transition of power. Isabeau did not accept the explanation. She accused her husband, in front of his own son, of allowing a shadow court to form around Fenwick, a rival center of influence operating beside the reigning monarch before his reign had even ended. The room went silent. Fenwick said nothing, though his silence carried its own weight. Aldric ordered his wife to withdraw the accusation. She refused, closed the folder of documents she had brought to argue her case, and told him plainly that she would not be treated as a placeholder while his son prepared to replace them both. It was, by every account later reconstructed by palace historians, the first time in the marriage that Isabeau had drawn a line her husband could not step over without consequence. Aldric did not act that night. He rarely acted quickly on matters involving his wife. Theirs had always been a partnership built on patience and negotiation rather than confrontation. But patience, this time, gave way to something else once he learned what Isabeau had done in the days following the summit meeting. Palace records, reviewed later by the Constitutional Council, showed that the Queen had quietly instructed several senior household officials to bypass Fenwick's staff entirely and report ceremonial planning decisions directly to her office. It was a small administrative maneuver on paper. In practice, it was an attempt to reassert control over a transition that had already begun, and it transformed a private family disagreement into something the king's advisors could no longer treat as a domestic matter. Duchess Yolara, the king's sister and long the most clear-eyed voice in his inner circle, urged him to act before the dispute became public and, worse, before it became a genuine constitutional crisis. Compassion cannot become paralysis, she told him during a private meeting neither of them expected to become as difficult as it did. She reminded her brother that he had delayed similar decisions before, always hoping the tension would resolve itself. It never had. That night, Aldrich ordered a full review of every privilege, authority, and ceremonial function attached to his wife's title. It was not yet a decision. It was, he told himself, only an inquiry. But Isabeau discovered the review within 2 days, and when she did not retreat quietly. She requested, no, insisted upon, a private meeting with her husband, without advisors, without their children, without the comforting distance of formal protocol. They met alone in the king's private study, the unsigned draft of a compromise settlement resting on the table between them. Aldrich had hoped to find a middle path. Isabeau would retain her title while surrendering the specific authorities that had caused the conflict, preserving the appearance of unity while quietly resolving the underlying dispute. Isabeau read the proposal once and pushed it back across the table. A title without influence, she told him, would reduce her to decoration. If she was going to lose everything that mattered, she would rather lose it openly than pretend, for the sake of palace appearances, that she still held a place she no longer occupied. The conversation that followed became the most painful of their 20-year marriage. Isabeau accused her husband of allowing Fenwick to dictate the terms of their household from outside the room. Aldrich, finally losing the careful restraint he had maintained for weeks, told her this was never about his son's ambition. It was about her refusal to accept boundaries that, as sovereign, he was obligated to enforce. Defending her now, he said, would mean admitting that his own authority could be quietly overridden without consequence. She reminded him that she had defended him through years when much of the kingdom viewed their marriage with open hostility. He did not deny it, but he told her, quietly, that love could not excuse a challenge to the succession itself. Then he placed the documents in front of her, the instructions she had sent bypassing Fenwick's household, and watched her expression change as explanation became impossible. For a long moment, she said nothing. She removed her wedding ring, set it on the table beside the unsigned draft, and let the silence stretch between them. Then, just as quietly, she put it back on. She told him she remained his wife, but she would not forgive being treated like a disloyal subordinate in her own household. She left without looking back. Aldrich sat alone for nearly an hour before summoning his private secretary and ordering the permanent proclamation prepared. What followed was not a single dramatic act, but a quiet, methodical dismantling carried out over the following days. The Queen's ceremonial briefing stopped. Her diary, once filled months in advance, was rewritten by palace staff. Engagements once assigned to her were redistributed to Fenwick, Odile, and Duchess Yolara. Letters addressed to Her Majesty began returning from the correspondence office under a different form of address. Aldrich insisted, against the advice of some of his more severe counselors, that none of it be handled as punishment. There would be no eviction from the family's private residences, no removal of Isabeau's personal protection detail, and no public statement suggesting the marriage itself had ended. He wanted the institution separated from his wife's former authority, not his wife separated from his life. It did not make the process painless. Isabeau watched, from an open doorway, as a member of the household staff removed the small brass plaque bearing her official designation from her study door. She asked that it be left with her rather than taken into storage, and held it for a long moment before her sister, visiting from the countryside, found her sitting quietly with it in her lap. She admitted in a rare unguarded moment that she had expected criticism and public scandal. She had never quite believed her husband would personally authorize the dismantling of everything she had spent 2 decades building. Several of her longtime aides resigned rather than transfer into the reorganized household, a small act of loyalty that comforted her even as it confirmed what she had feared. Her official role was not being reduced. It was ending. The most difficult reckoning, however, was not with her husband but with his son. Isabeau requested a private meeting with Fenwick. No advisors, no palace officials, no protocol standing between them. She had believed for weeks that he had quietly engineered her downfall from behind the scenes. She wanted, finally, to hear him admit it. He arrived without documents or briefing notes. When she asked whether he had wanted her removed from the very beginning, he told her the truth as he understood it. He had never asked his father to choose between his marriage and his son, and he had accepted that marriage without complaint for years. But he could not accept 2 competing centers of authority surrounding the same crown. Not because he doubted her intentions, but because he understood, with the particular clarity of someone who would one day inherit the position, that divided authority would eventually poison the reign that followed his father's. It was not the answer of an enemy. It was, Isabeau realized, the answer of someone who had thought carefully about a burden she had not fully considered from his side of it. He acknowledged, without being asked, the years of public scrutiny she had endured beside his father, and told her plainly that losing her title did not erase that history. It was recognition, not cruelty, and it unsettled her far more than an argument would have. She admitted, finally, that fear had driven much of what she had done. Fear of becoming irrelevant as the next generation rose around her, fear that every year of sacrifice might be quietly written out of the kingdom's memory. Fenwick promised her a place within the family, even if not within the machinery of state. She agreed, at last, not to challenge the proclamation. She asked only that his father never be forced to publicly condemn her. He gave her his word. When the news reached the public the following morning, Verland's response was immediate and divided. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming. Crowds gathered outside the Alabaster Palace gates, uncertain whether to mourn or debate. Some called the king's decision an overdue correction to a monarchy that could not sustain 2 competing claims to authority. Others called it a quiet cruelty dressed in constitutional language. The palace's official statement was brief and carefully worded. Isabeau remained the king's wife and a member of the royal family, but she would no longer carry out duties or hold authority connected to the position of queen. It satisfied no one entirely, which was perhaps the only honest outcome available. Later that day, Aldrich and Isabeau appeared together for a brief public departure from the palace. No announcement, no stage statement, simply the king offering his hand as she stepped into the car ahead of him, waiting until she was seated before joining her. It restored no title. It reversed nothing, but it told the watching crowd, more clearly than any statement could, that whatever had ended between them publicly, something else had survived. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom of Verland settled into its altered arrangement. Isabeau formally accepted a lesser ceremonial style, surrendered her remaining duties, and stepped back from public life with a dignity that surprised even her harshest critics. The line of succession, once clouded by competing authority, became unambiguous. Fenwick's position solidified. Odile's public role, once a source of quiet tension, was no longer shadowed by rivalry. Aldrich found his wife that evening in their private apartment and told her, simply, that the institution was safe. She answered that she had once believed becoming queen had justified every difficult year that preceded it. Now she understood that remaining beside him without the title would require a different, quieter kind of resolve. He assured her that the proclamation governed the crown, not his devotion to her. Their marriage endured, though on terms neither of them would have chosen a year earlier. At the family's next private gathering, Fenwick approached her before she could retreat to the far side of the room, and stayed beside her long enough to make his intention unmistakable. Warmth had not yet returned between them, but hostility had given way to something steadier. Recognition, restraint, and an uneasy peace that both understood might be the only kind available to them now. The kingdom of Verland emerged from its quiet crisis wounded but intact, a monarchy that had learned, at considerable